There are places where history doesn't feel like something that you simply read. Instead, it feels like something that you stand and experience. And the Cumberland Gap is one of those places. Long before the highways ever crossed through this mountain range, before towns or state lines were dreamed up, there was only a narrow passageway that led through the Appalachian wilderness. For thousands of years, people came here searching for what lay beyond the mountains. Some of those people were hunters. Many of those people were a part of families, and all of them were led by a dream. But among all of the footsteps that have traveled through the gap, there's one name that is synonymously written within its history. That name is Daniel Boone. And history remembers him as an explorer. But I wonder, standing at the edge of these mountains, did he simply feel like a man whose life no longer fit the world that stood behind him? And I ask that question out loud as I stand here, nearly 2.5 centuries later, in this same very spot. But I find myself asking different questions. Not just who was Daniel Boone, but I also find myself asking, who am I becoming? Because eventually, every one of us reaches a Cumberland Gap, a place where the identity that we've spent years building no longer fits what lies ahead. We end up reaching a place where there are no maps. There's no certainty. In that place, we only find choices. We have to choose whether we stay where it's familiar or we step bravely into the unknown. And that's when I realized something very significant. The wilderness around me, it doesn't care who I am. It's only here to reveal what's deep within. Welcome to the Honest Outdoors podcast. I'm Mike Martin, and this is a Project Mindfully Outdoors presentation. This season begins with my new book, The Honest Wilderness, Finding Daniel Boone in the Frontier Within. But my friend, it doesn't end there. Because together, we'll be walking the trails, visiting the places, and uncovering the stories that shape the American frontier, not simply to better understand history, but to better understand ourselves. So if you're ready, let's make our way on down the trail. I always believed that certain places had this way of asking questions much better than people do. Not because they're magical, but because they had this way of stripping away the noise until you're finally left alone with the truth. And for myself, stepping into the Cumberland Gap not only felt as if I was stepping onto hollow ground, but it quickly became one of those very places for me. You know, like most people, I arrived here expecting to not only take in some beautiful scenery and learn more about Daniel Boone, but also to take a deeper journey, one that allowed me to visit the frontier within, the one that you can't see, the one that came about when there was no more land to traverse, and the unfamiliar and unknown territory became life itself. And that's when I found myself really diving deep into my journal before I set out on the trail, because I thought really hard about where I found myself in life. Standing there, looking through that narrow break in the mountains, I couldn't stop wondering what it must have felt like to leave everything behind, to begin to traverse from a place that everything felt safe into a world that was unknown. I'm sure that it not only took a sense of bravery, but it took commitment to walk away from that certainty, to step onto a trail that led you into the wilderness that offered no guarantees. I think about how nowadays we really romanticize those kind of moments. We put our stock in the imagination, that beautiful picture of what courage must truly have felt like back then, what the adventure looked like, and that grand sense of freedom that a wide open space truly offers. But then I stopped and I really started to ask myself, what kind of people actually embraced those feelings, those thoughts? Were they simply trying to put some kind of peaceful spin on the uncertainty? Because every step into the unknown truly requires leaving something behind. That's exactly where I found myself. There was a season when life just simply put me in a position that everything I carefully built no longer fit. Not because it was bad, and not because I regretted where I was at, but because somewhere along the way, I had to become someone different. At first, I couldn't explain it. There was a series of tragic events that life handed me as a taste of its bad medicine. And I thought the process truly meant that I had to grieve for everything that had been lost. And the more that I followed that path, the more I found myself stumbling around with a loss of direction. And eventually, I realized that grieving, it meant something much deeper. It meant that I wasn't grieving the things that I had lost. Instead, I was grieving the loss of the identity that I had found so much comfort within. Who was I at that very point in time if I wasn't the person that I had spent so many years becoming? Then really, what was it? What was out there and meant for me? And I remember, and I think, as I gaze out into the open wilderness now, standing here at the Cumberland Gap, I couldn't help but sit there and just wonder if Daniel Boone had ever wrestled with that very question. History remembers him as a frontier hero. Before he became a legend, though, he was simply a man. He was a father, a husband, a hunter, a surveyor, someone trying to find where he belonged in the rapidly changing world around him. His frontier, his frontier looked much different than mine. But change has always been a constant in life. And the reality of it is that each time change shows up at somebody's door, it's always asking the same question. It doesn't matter what generation you live in. Who are you when the life that you know disappears? Who are you when the certainty that you know gives way to the wilderness that you don't know? And the more that I researched Boone's life, the more I stopped seeing him as simply a tall tale or an icon. I began seeing him as another human who was simply trying to navigate the uncertainty of the world around him. And maybe that's why his story has endured, not because he conquered the wilderness, but because he kept walking when he couldn't see what was waiting around the next ridge. I think within that, there's a lesson that history rarely ever really talks about. And it's why the Cumberland Gap wasn't just a passageway through the mountains. In my eyes, it truly represents a threshold. On one side, everything was familiar. And then on the other, you had no way of knowing what life was going to throw at you next. Every person who crossed through the gap surrendered something in order to do so. They had to give up comfort of life. I think the hardest part was giving up everything that they had known. While writing The Honest Wilderness, I really took time to look back through my journal entries as I went through this journey for the first time, and I documented every step of the way. I thought just something that would be special for myself. The more I visited and hiked and traveled the places that I did, it was just about learning more about Daniel Boone. Instead, I found myself confronting these questions and much more over and over in my journal. I carried those journals with me in my pack through the woods, and originally it started out as just frantic, discombobulated writing. And over time, the further that I got along the trail, the more that frantic writing slowly turned into personal conversations, not just engaging with history, but engaging with myself. The deeper that I traveled into Boone's story, the further I got into myself, and the further that I connected with who I truly am. And the more that I did that, the more that I realized how deep nature can really invite you to find yourself. And I think the best part about it is the fact that we all, even though we struggle with these deep questions, things like, how do we begin again? How do we let go of that identity that we've outgrown? The more that I realized as I was writing to myself, having these conversations, the more I realized that even though our lives are centuries apart and so different in the way that they looked, the internal threads were exactly the same. Because we all battle those questions silently, in conversation, in a journal, wherever they come out. We all have to wrestle with things like, how do we begin again? How do we let go of the identity that we've outgrown? How do we move forward when that trail isn't clear anymore? And that's what the wilderness has to offer. Not the easy answers. Instead, it's the honest ones. Because the truth is, the wilderness doesn't care about that resume. It doesn't care about your reputation. It doesn't care about the titles that you've earned, the mistakes that you've made. The mountains don't know about your accomplishments. The rivers don't feel your failures. The forest doesn't care about the people you think you know. It simply meets you exactly where you stand at any point in time. And sometimes that's the most honest place that you can ever find. Standing at the Cumberland Gap, I realized something that has stayed with me ever since the first time I visited here. The Cumberland Gap wasn't really west. The frontier, that's within. Boone crossing the mountains, I've crossed seasons of my life. He stepped into unfamiliar country. I've stepped into unfamiliar questions. Both journeys begin the exact same way, by admitting that there's no going back. Maybe that's what eventually really defines any sort of meaningful journey, is the requirement of understanding that statement. Not becoming something completely different, but having the courage to let go of what no longer serves you. Looking back now, I don't think losing my identity was the end of the story. I think it was an invitation. The invitation to stop living according to who I thought I should be, and to begin discovering who I actually am. Maybe that's why places like the Cumberland Gap still matter so much. Not because they've changed American history, but because they remind us that every generation has its own frontier that it can conquer. It has its own wilderness to be explored. And it has its own moments when life quietly asks, will you stay where it's familiar? Or will you trust what's waiting on the other side? Because I don't believe that the frontier truly disappeared. I think it's gone inward. And sooner or later, every one of us must decide if we're willing to cross. Next time, we'll move beyond the legend of Mr. Daniel Boone, and we'll meet the man that history has often overlooked. We're going to talk about the things that he got right, not because he was perfect, but because he understood something that many of us spend our entire lives trying to find. That sometimes the only way forward is to begin again. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Honest Outdoors. If these conversations resonate with you, I'd be honored if you would follow the show, leave a review, share it with somebody who might need to join us on our journey. I hear all those things go a long way in helping us to progress. You can learn more about not only the Honest Outdoors podcast, get a copy of the Honest Wilderness book, but Project Mindfully Outdoors as well. You can explore all the additional stories and discover the frontier within by visiting projectmindfullyoutdoors.com. Until next time, my friend, get out there in the wilderness. That's where the honesty and the adventure lie. See ya.